Welcome, everybody. In the interest of being prompt, we'll get started. I know there's still people that are walking in. There are sign-up sheets outside, but you can sign them up afterwards as well. I'd like to welcome everybody here tonight. My name's Jack Estel. I am with the Department of Economics. I'm a lecturer here. Some of you have seen me around, had the misfortune of having my classes, and I'm surprised to see you, okay? But thank you for showing up. Maybe we can take a minute, and everyone can look at their electronic devices like me. As you know, this happens to me in class all the time, and we could try turning these off. That would come in handy. Great, thank you. Welcome to our first provocative lecture for the spring of 2014. Really? The spring of 2014? Wow, it's going so fast. I'm glad to see you all joined us tonight. We're in a little different venue than we've been before. This is very nice. It's cozy, I think. After the lecture tonight, we will also be meeting at Flames Restaurant, as we have in the past. That is on the corner of 4th and San Fernando. And we will have a meeting of what we call the Barstool Economists. The Barstool Economists is a virtual web-based group of people who are interested in economic ideas, and we often share ideas on that website. So this is an opportunity for us to actually see each other face-to-face. I'm sorry, I'm not speaking to this probably is going to help, huh? We get a chance to see each other face-to-face, and we welcome anyone who would like to join. It's also a Yahoo group, so you're welcome to apply to it. And it's not really that difficult to get accepted, right? I'm on it, so just so you know. But we do cover some very interesting ideas. There are people all over the country. There are over 400 people on it right now. So we will meet afterwards, and we'll give us an opportunity to sit down and talk a little bit more about the ideas that Barbara's going to talk about tonight. And I think Barbara's going to join us. So some of the faculty will actually join us as well, and you can hang out with us. Woohoo! Okay. Let's see. I should also mention, tomorrow morning, Barbara has been very kind to offer to give us another talk, and that one will be on how to excel in math and science. That lecture will be held from 10 to 11 o'clock in Engineering 189. So feel free to join us for that as well. I'm looking forward to that discussion as well. Let me also mention that our next provocative lecture will feature Cindy Cohn. Cindy Cohn is the legal counsel for the Electronic Frontier Foundation, and she will have a debate over the privacy security trade-off. And our other speaker I will announce shortly as soon as the plans for that are confirmed. That will happen on April 2nd at the same time, but we'll be in Morris Daly Auditorium for that. So you're welcome to join us for that as well. This lecture series started 13 years ago to foster our department's vision of higher education, which is confronting challenging ideas and developing critical thinking in an environment of respectful intellectual discourse. I hope that you will sit back, relax, but engage your calculative brain as Professor Oakley discusses her thoughts about how trying to do good can sometimes end in doing bad. We will provide a question and answer period at the end of this presentation to allow the audience to ask questions. It's our hope that this lecture series will allow a more thorough understanding of people's desire to help others and a greater appreciation for well-reasoned, diverse opinions. Barbara Oakley is joining us tonight. She is an associate professor of engineering in the Department of Industrial and Systems Engineering at Oakland University in Michigan. Her work focuses on the complex relationship between neurocircuitry and social behavior. She is a recipient of the Oakland University Teaching Excellence Award in 2013. Not that easy to do, and I commend her for that. And many other teaching awards. She's also received the NSF Antarctic Service Medal following her work as a communication expert at the South Pole Station. Prior to her academic career, Barbara rose from private to captain in the U.S. Army. Again, not so easy to do. during which time she was recognized as a distinguished military scholar. She has worked as a Russian translator aboard Soviet trawlers in the Bering Sea. Interesting. This is sort of an interesting background. And she has been elected a fellow of the American Institute of Medical and Biological Engineering. Professor Oakley received a bachelor's degree in Slavic languages at UW, University of Washington, while in the Army, and returned to school for a BS in electrical engineering. She then attended Oakland University, where she completed an MS in electrical and computer engineering and a PhD in systems engineering. She was hired upon graduation and continues to teach at Oakland. Please give her a welcome, warm welcome. Thank you. When you're ready for questions, I will take the microphone around.
Okay, perfect. Okay. Can you hear me? I hope. I'm so glad to be here. Thank you so much for inviting me. And your economics department here is an absolute powerhouse, and the chair, Lydia Ortega, is unbelievable. So it's a very much of an honor for me to be here. And with that, I'd like to start by giving you a little bit of perspective. In science, we like to think that perspective doesn't matter, right? But it does matter. It matters a lot. So I'd like to start by giving you a little bit of a feeling from my own perspective. If you look, I grew up moving all the time. By the time I hit 10th grade, I lived in 10 different places. Even as an adult, I moved all the time. I had many different jobs and even careers before I settled into academia to become a professor of engineering. So all of these different positions and different locations gave me it allowed me to indulge in one of my favorite hobbies, and that is people watching. You can learn a lot about people by watching them from unusual perspectives. So, for example, when I worked at in Antarctica, I knew a guy there named Neil, and Neil was an unbelievable mimic. He was just this thin, little, wispy guy with a big head, so he sort of looked like this upside-down exclamation point. But what he loved to do was he loved to do imitations of the 6'6" gorilla of a station manager, Art Brown. So one day, Neil was sitting at the administrative office in McMurdo, and the phone rings. And so Neil, as usual, picked it up and said, "Hello, this is Art Brown speaking," in a perfect imitation of Art Brown's voice. And it was Art Brown on the other end of the line. So Art says, "Who the hell is this?" And Neil says, "Why, Art, this is you. I'm so glad you've gotten in touch with yourself." And so that's actually what we're going to be doing here today. We're going to be getting in touch a little bit with yourself, your perspectives, your motives and notions, because as you'll see, that will flavor everything you understand about what I speak about here today. If you look, you can see here the Structure of Scientific Revolutions by Thomas Kuhn was a seminal work in the history of science. And what Kuhn talked about, he also thought perspective was very important in the progress of science. And his work showed that, at least from his perspective, innovations and paradigm shifts, those sort of seismic events in science, often take place as a result of two different kinds of people. The first people are young people like yourselves, like many of you here. You haven't yet been entrained in the thinking modalities of your elders. And so you're able to look with a little bit more perspective and independence at what is going on, and that can allow you to think more independently and to actually see more perceptively. The other group of people are people who've been trained in a different discipline. So they haven't been, in some sense, indoctrinated by the ideas of the discipline in question, and they're able to look at it more independently. So these kinds of ideas, paradigm shifts, and looking independently are very important in what we're going to talk about. Indeed, science is a gift. It's a great gift for all of us, this skeptical approach, skeptical way of looking at things. If you look at that little girl right there, this picture was taken in 1948. 3 weeks after this picture was taken, this little girl was in an iron lung fighting for her life. She had just gotten polio, and polio would go on to ruin her life. That little girl was my older sister. By the time I came along, 10 years later, look at me, a happy camper, right? It was a completely different paradigm in the country itself. Before, it had always been polio, anyone can get it at any time, and parents were absolutely terrified. But because of that skeptical, careful, rational approach that science was able to take, we all benefited, and benefited greatly. Now, I want to give you a little more understanding of my perspectives. Altruism is generally thought of as the unselfish concern for the welfare of others. So in my own family, we believe altruism is very important. That the girl in red there is actually our older daughter. She's president of Habitat for Humanity. And she as with our family in general, really believes in helping others. We have 2 adopted Muslim sons who we put through the university, who were refugees from the Kosovo War. We truly believe in helping others. And it is from precisely that sense that I speak to you here today about how altruism can be among humankind's best traits, but also provides the potential for some of our most deeply harmful activities. Now, where does altruism arise? I mean, altruism doesn't come from a vacuum. You can't be altruistic all by yourself, right? In fact, it seems to arise, we know that there are genetic predispositions that allow you to empathize with others, to feel about caring for others. And these genetic predispositions they're shaped by evolution itself, and of course by the social structures that we work in. So when scientists go and look at altruism, they often think that altruism and our caring for others arises primarily from our feelings of empathy for others. And in essence, empathy is thought to arise from several different cognitive processes or emotional processes. The first is sort of a very fast feeling of empathy and caring for others that arises from our emotional, the emotional basis of our brains. And the other aspect of empathy often deals with our cognitive understanding of what another person must be experiencing, regardless of how we feel about that other person. So there's emotion and cognitive approaches. And you can kind of back away and say, so what motivates people to be pro-social? And of course, the real question is, what is pro-social? And all of these are under intense investigation by scientists. In fact, we are beginning to discover that there really are 2 very different processes that occur when we're thinking of helping others. And this has brought out very well by a recent case in Brazil where an individual presented with a left lenticular capsular stroke. And what this did was, as it turns out, he simply couldn't manage his financial life, right? He would go out, see some street kids, and have this impulsive desire to help these street kids. And if his wife or his family didn't watch him, he'd just give away everything. He couldn't run a business anymore, although he'd been a very successful business manager, because he just had this impulse to just let it all go. And he wouldn't watch his finances or keep up with things. So what psychiatrists finally concluded was it seemed this person had a kind of an impulse disorder. He could follow his emotional thinking, but not balance that out with cognitive thinking so that he could handle what was going on in his life appropriately. So these kinds of ideas were explored in depth by Nobel Prize-winning psychologist Daniel Kahneman. And what Kahneman posited was, well, as you can see from the title of his brilliant book, Thinking Fast and Slow, that there are two sort of thinking systems. One is very fast, and that fast system, as it seems, involves our emotional feelings of empathy, whereas slower cognitive processes take more time, but they allow us to solve problems and kind of deliberate in a very helpful fashion. And the fast processes deal with empathy. And empathy, as you probably can tell, is receiving enormous attention from society today. There's thousands of books published on empathy and the importance of empathy, the overwhelming importance of empathy. And yet, empathy has a dark side, and that's often not addressed. Instead, it's the idea that empathy is the universal solvent. So let's talk a little bit about empathy and some of the problems that can arise from empathy. First is the idea of codependency. Codependency, if you know anything at all about, battered women, ostensibly are physically hurt or damaged or injured by their husbands or their significant others. And what happens is, and this is a real occurrence, the woman often, but not always, so empathizes with the individual they're cohabiting with that they often will over and over again forgive that individual and allow them to do the same sort of damage again. So what happens is the individual is, the codependent person so empathizes that they simply can't bear negative affect, sort of nasty behavior in the other, and they'll do whatever it takes to stop it, even if it's detrimental for that person and even for themselves. They have a brother who has alcoholism or something like that. They will give the alcohol, right, even though that's harmful for their brother, just to help them feel better, because it will make them feel better. So there is virtually no scientific research on codependency, none. So what you see are things like this. One single book, Codependent No More, has sold over 5 million copies. There's so much interest in this sort of behavior and so much of a cry for help from people that they'll buy 5 million copies of a book. So because science isn't looking, people just look elsewhere for help. And that's why these kinds of issues are so important. In fact, what it seems is we have this one-size-fits-all mentality towards helping others. Even though genetics and a lot of neuroimaging is beginning to reveal that people vary a lot in their individual predispositions for altruism and caring for others. But we treat everyone as if they were the same, right? One size fits all. Altruism, empathy, and caring is always good for everyone in virtually every circumstance. And what this can do is set up some individuals, especially hypersensitive individuals, with no defenses. If they are hypersensitive, all they ever hear is the message of, you should help anyway. And it allows others to more easily take advantage of them. So what are some of the problems that are affiliated with empathy? If we look, the first area is stress and personality dysfunction. So, for example, let's say that you're feeling a little bit depressed, and you have a good friend who's depressed, and you empathize with your friend. What do? You're actually bringing each other down. You can bring both of you down into a depressed state because of your empathy. Burnout. Let's say that you work in a job such as nursing, and you're giving palliative care for people who are terminally ill. And you are told, you must empathize. You must care for and empathize the individuals that are under your care. That is good. That is important. And that is part of why people in this position burn out constantly. More than half of all nurses leave the profession within 2 years after they've graduated. Why? Burnout. If all you're ever taught is empathize, and yet you're inflicting pain sometimes on the patient you're trying to care for, it makes things very, very difficult. And more than that, we've talked about codependency. There's also gullibility. We got on the train to come here from the airport yesterday. We were riding over the rental car. And I was very interested to see this fellow march. He was looking at all the cars, and he was a stocky, well-built guy, and he had no airport equipment, no luggage, no nothing. And he looked at our car, and he hops in, and as we're going along, he begins to speak. And he says, you know what? My son left his baggage behind, and I need to buy all this equipment for him, because otherwise I'm going to end up going to jail because there's these problems here, and I'm a military vet, and I've done this, and I've done that. And he had this spiel worked out perfectly, and I'm sitting there listening to this guy, because I could tell there was something funny about him even before he got on the train. And yet people began handing him, one fella handed him $60, another. And what is this kind of behavior? You can see that this helping, our urge to help, can actually sometimes be detrimental for us because we can be taken advantage of. The first thing a con artist does is empathize with you and create your empathy for them. And so what other kinds of things can happen? Irrationality, sometimes cloaked with quasi-rationality. So what I mean by this are things like motivated reasoning. What motivated reasoning means something like this. Let's say that you're hired by the prosecutor's office, and you're a psychologist, and you're supposed to present findings, and you know you're hired by the prosecutor's office. Who are you going to find for? Prosecutor's office, right? You empathize with those who you have been hired by. It also can contribute to emotional contagion. If you're sitting here in this room and you look around and you know that most people believe something pretty similar to what you believe, it's hard for you to step out of that, to think independently. So this kind of emotional contagion is why it's so rare to find whistleblowers. Whistleblowers feel terrific pressure from their coworkers not to blow the whistle. And when you blow the whistle, you're suddenly ostracized by your group. That's really painful. And this, again, is a detrimental aspect of empathy. So bubbles, economic bubbles, can arise from this kind of thing. In fact, what I want to do is just give you a little bit of a quote from Robert Shiller. He was on the panel of the economic advisors for the Federal Reserve Bank of New York during that 2008 bubble. And what he wrote was, I thought, very perceptive. He said, I felt the need to use restraint in what he was thinking and talking about. He said, while I warned about the bubbles I believed were developing in the stock and housing markets, I did so very gently and felt vulnerable from expressing such quirky views. Deviating too far from the consensus leaves one feeling potentially ostracized from the group with the risk that one may be terminated. So here's an individual who saw this bubble happening, and he couldn't really say anything. Why? Because he empathized with those he worked with. Hurting others. How could hurting others arise from empathy? Think about it this way. If you're a surgeon at a hospital, you probably have experienced rules at your hospital, and those rules say you cannot operate on one of your own relatives. Why? Because you're so emotionally involved that you can actually inadvertently hurt your relative. And more than that, there's something called parochial altruism. What that means is you feel altruism for those in your in-group, whereas it's very easy for you to think it's okay to hurt those outside your in-group. So this is why, for example, you see things like this. When the Rwandan genocides occurred, you didn't have someone who was just, a Hutu didn't wake up in the morning and say, I'm just going to be Dr. Evil today, and I'm just going to kill Tutsis because it's fun, right? They don't think that. What they think is, those Tutsis are cockroaches who are going to injure and kill those who I love. So I'm going to kill them first. So your empathy itself actually serves to draw you together and to ostracize others. Suicide bombers. What's the one common trait that suicide bombers have? Altruism. They care for their in-group so much that they're willing to kill themselves to help their in-group, even though they're killing innocents while they're at it. So this is a wonderful optical illusion by Robert Shepard. And this is the kind of thing I'm talking about when I say empathy and our emotions can sometimes fool us. If you look at these tabletops, they look like they have to be a different size. But I'm going to show you that they're not, right? If you look here, now watch, I'm not going to fiddle with it. It's the same size. Now watch what happens. Exactly the same size. It doesn't seem possible, does it? But you've been misled. You've been fooled by your eyes, these cues. And in the same way, you can be misled by your emotions about what is truly possible in helping others. So, in fact, there's been reams written on what is called prosocial behavior. But what is prosocial behavior? Sometimes it's almost like, I feel like the academic writing is something along the lines of the definition of pornography. As one Supreme Court justice wrote, well, I can't define it, but I know it when I see it, right? But it's almost like that for prosocial behavior. If it looks obviously helpful, it must be prosocial. And if it doesn't, it must not be. But is that truly the case? In fact, there's a wonderful study published in 1978 by Joan McCord. And what she did was she went back in the 1930s. They took 500 students in the Boston area. And they split these students into two groups. One group, they gave all this, they said that's the control group. The other group, they gave all this wonderful care to. They gave them counseling, tutoring, medical care, psychiatric care, summer programs, all the great things you think would be enormously helpful in allowing people to get a great start. They gave these students this program for 5 years. But what Joan McCourt did was she said, I wonder whatever happened to these students. So 30 years later, she did a follow-up. And first she found that 2/3 of the children, or the ones who had been in that helpful program, thought that the program had truly helped them. They remembered their counselors very fondly. But when they analyzed the actual data using the skepticism of science, here's what they found. They found that those who had received all this help were more likely to have committed crimes, more alcoholism, more serious mental illness, more stress, right? They died younger. They took on positions with much lower prestige. They were less likely to find their job satisfying. So all this help actually had a completely counterintuitive effect. Why? I'll let you think yourselves why that might be. So there's a research gap. We often study apparent prosocial behavior. That's just enormous. Everybody studies it. And sometimes we'll study behavior that looks prosocial but is actually antisocial, so psychopaths' behavior. But even though we often also study truly antisocial behavior or apparent antisocial behavior, we often do not study apparent antisocial behavior that is actually truly prosocial. In other words, it may look mean, it may look nasty, it may look greedy or self-serving, and it's actually possibly more beneficial than you might ever imagine. Let's just give one little example of a very interesting finding related to self-esteem. Self-esteem, as it turns out, is that's been sort of a buzzword. It's been promoted for the last few decades. But what researchers have noticed recently is that hand in hand with this self-esteem movement has grown narcissism. So what we'll see, for example, is that students may think they're really good at mathematics or something like that, and they think they are, but they're simply not. But they've got so high self-esteem about it. And so this can create obvious problems. Now, how can we kind of fall into these kinds of things? First off, there's a phenomenon called Einstellung. What happens with Einstellung is we get an initial idea in mind, and this was discovered in chess, and that blocks our ability to see better ideas. So once we think we have a solution, we not only stop looking for other solutions, but we actually can't easily grasp new solutions because we've got this idea already in mind. Now keep in mind, what happens with empathy? Empathy's fast. It gives you a quick, hey, this is how we help, and this is what we're going to do. But once that comes in mind, it can block slower, more rational, cognitive approaches that are genuinely more beneficial for others. Now, when we're looking at something like altruism, what we can find is genuine compassion for others. But there's also other things going on inside people. For example, there's also self-addiction, right? You get helper's high from helping others. In other words, you really don't care whether the person is ultimately helped. You know you're doing good, right? And so that makes you feel better. And that's why we can see these kinds of things such as we've found that a lot of philanthropy, for example, in Africa, actually goes to support the despotic regimes that are committing some of these horrific actions. And so we think we're helping, and actually what we're doing is helping more crimes to be committed. But we feel good about it, right? So that's all that matters for some people. Also, there's this self-righteousness. Think about it this way. If there's obsessive compulsive disorder. So what happens with that is you turn off the stove, you walk away, and then you go, did I really turn it off? So it's a disorder of certainty. You're uncertain about things. So you don't have enough certainty. But there's another way you can go as far as personality problems, and that is you are overly certain. You're very self-righteous. You're very certain that what you're doing is appropriate. And we've all known people who are so self-certain that it's actually difficult to talk to them because they're certain they've got all the answers. There's also narcissism. Narcissism is one of the most strongly heritable of all traits. And yet, what it involves is this simple notion that whatever I think, I decide, has got to be good, regardless of the facts, regardless of what's truly going on. All of these can often play a profoundly important role in altruism. So we're finally at a point where I can actually define altruism, or pathological altruism. So what is pathological altruism? So pause for a moment. Pathological altruism is a subjectively pro-social act. That means to you inside, it feels like it's right, it's helping others. That is objectively, in other words, somebody else looking externally, is antisocial. That is about as good a way as you can quantify pathological altruism. So I worked on this and, in fact, created an edited book with my co-editors called Pathological Altruism. And you can see there's Edward O. Wilson, who's one of the top scientists in the world, wrote, "What a wonderful book," and went on from there. And the foreword was written by Francisco Ayala, who's the Templeton Award winner. And I like how he phrased things. What he said, essentially, was, when I first got this manuscript, I thought, altruism could be harmful for people sometimes, but, it must be really rare for that to happen. And he said, after I looked at this book, I realized it's all around us, all the time. We're always doing this. We always think that altruism is this wonderful, good thing, and everybody is pretty similar in their notions of altruism. That's completely untrue. When you talk to people who are from different religious groups, different cultures, different political backgrounds, they all have very different notions of what it truly means to help others. So perspectives really do matter. They matter a lot. When I was young, probably one of the biggest questions of our lives in the early 1970s was, which system is better, capitalism or communism? And so I was very curious about this, and I began to realize as I was trying to explore these ideas that I couldn't figure out who was telling the truth. Because there were so many people who kind of came at it from their own ideological perspectives that it was hard to tease out what the honest facts were. So I thought, well, heck, now what do I do? Well, I guess what I'll do is I'll enlist in the Army and I'll go to Vietnam and I'll kind of see what I see for myself. And so fortunately for me, the war ended beforehand. And but I learned Russian, and I instead went out and worked for the communists as a Russian translator on Soviet trawlers, spent several years doing that, and got to know communism really very, very well indeed. And that helped shape some of my thinking about this particular area. So nowadays, there's past perspectives for how people would frame altruism. And people have often in the past framed it as something like, there's the mountain voles and the prairie voles. And the prairie voles, they kind of like hanging out together. They're gregarious. And the mountain voles, they don't do that. They're not like helpful of each other. They're more like lone wolves, kind of like our cats, right? And so that often has been how altruism has been characterized, sort of by its presence or its absence. Now, Simon Baron Cohen in England, who's done a lot of research on Asperger's and autism, characterizes altruism and caring for others like this. He says, there's highly caring, highly empathic individuals, and that's sort of like a positive thing. Or you can be uncaring and lack empathy, that's like a 0. Or you can be psychopathic, right? They're not only lacking in empathy, they're sort of the other way. They're negative on that scale. But what I like to look at as far as altruism goes is you can be altruistic, but there can be trade-offs. And if you look at those trade-offs, sometimes those trade-offs are so negative for some kind of small bit of help that you're doing, there can be so much harm that takes place that actually it's not worth it. So there are different ways to frame all of these ideas, and I think framing in different ways allows you to begin to understand that altruism is not always a good thing. If you're truly caring and truly want to help others, you must take altruism off that sacred pedestal and realize sometimes it's used to get people to do very harmful things. Let's just look here at, from an evolutionary perspective, this is brood parasitism. What happens here is you have, in this case, the cuckoo came, and there's the reed warbler who's feeding its offspring, right? Its own nurturing tendencies have been taken advantage of, and actually, from an evolutionary perspective, can be harmful. So it's always the case that perspectives matter, right? For the cuckoo bird, they're getting help, right? But let's imagine that we're sort of a person like that block there, and we're getting assistance from something that's like an infinite pool. In engineering, we would think of it as something like a hot reservoir that's infinite in size. If you're getting help from something that's that big, what does it matter? You're drawing this help and you're not hurting anybody. But what if you kind of realize that the size of the reservoir is actually limited? Then you start to deal with things in a little bit of a different way. Or what if you are only concerned about your own perspective, despite the fact that there may be other people drawing for the reservoir? Or that can be contrasted with something like this. What if your perspective is you're aware of all the drains on the reservoir and you're concerned about all of them? All of these issues are important when you're thinking about altruism. Perspective is really important. So you may be wondering, what the heck are you doing up here? You're in engineering. What does that have to do with social science sorts of concerns? But I'd like to remind you of something. Analogy and the ability to bring analogies helps create sparkling new insights. And engineering has great analogies that can be applied to a number of different areas. For example, we analyze first law, energy balance. What goes out must come in. And that's an analogy that's helpful in some cases. But also, we analyze issues from the perspective of entropy, right? What entropy means is you can have a process occurring, and the consequences of those processes can actually affect far more broadly than that initial small process would ever lead you to believe. More than just analogy, we can do things like root cause analysis. In root cause analysis, you don't just put a Band-Aid to fix something. You actually go and look at what the real processes are in order to fix them. So this can have dramatic implications, this kind of approach, in a number of different areas. For example, even education itself. Do you want to fix students as they're arriving at college, a Band-Aid? Or do you want to help students have a great educational process all the way through? Optimization and trade-offs. These kinds of things. Mike Hammer was a wonderful corporate analyst, and he did a careful review of companies all around the world to try and see if there was anything in common with these companies. What he found was there was one thing in common. All of the best companies had engineers as their CEOs. What he felt was that the engineering training allowed them to think in terms of trade-offs. And that's very important. As engineers, we could always build you a car that, you'd never die in an accident, unless it was a nuclear accident or something. But it'd be so expensive, so difficult to build that no one would want to or be able to afford to buy it. So there's always all these trade-offs, and that's the way we often think about things. And that's actually important in dealing with ideas like altruism. We also bring in a very firm grounding in science. How is that important? I want to remind you that in some disciplines, you can have groups of faculty who can band together in an entire discipline and think that an approach is right for decade after decade after decade, sailing along on something that's actually completely incorrect. And in engineering, what happens is if you design something and you have a theory that's wrong, your plane goes down, everybody dies. So there's two very different approaches. One where you see the consequences of incorrect thinking. The other where people can reinforce one another in incorrect thinking and sail on oblivious to the ramifications of what they're working on. In the 1800s, there were these concepts known as blistering and cupping. All doctors knew that if someone, for example, had pneumonia, what you do is you take a glass, you'd heat it red hot, and you'd put it on their chest, and pus would come up, right? So obviously what you were doing was drawing this phlegm off the person and helping to cure them. And likewise, if someone was really sick to the point of death, you wanted to take a lot of blood out of them because it was obviously malevolent blood that was making them, be sick. George Washington had over half the blood in his body drained before he died. So all of these kinds of things, how could they arise? How could people think these kinds of things? Because it was obvious, right? And then when everybody starts thinking it, well, that's what everybody knows is the right thing to do. And it's hard to think independently. And science itself is what brings the skepticism and starts bringing the approaches you need to begin scientifically understanding what's going on. So in medicine now, which is far more successful, we see that medical treatments are tested carefully before they're implemented broadly in society. But what's interesting, however, is attempts to solve major social and behavioral processes are not tested. They're simply implemented because they sound good. They must be beneficial for everyone. And so that's why in vitally important areas, including those involving racial prejudice, adolescent behavior problems, drug use, post-traumatic stress disorder, there are all these programs that are implemented, but nobody checks them because they've got to be good. One program alone, I'll just go in, is called Critical Incident Stress Debriefing. What this program, this therapeutic method was developed, and the idea was if somebody was hurt, right, or like let's say that you saw your best friend be killed, right, what a therapist would do is have you come and relive that experience, tell it, to get it out, right? Now we understand that what that actually does is it reaffirms that experience. It actually makes post-traumatic stress syndrome worse for those individuals. Yet, after 9/11, nearly 10,000 therapists descended on New York City and implemented this approach to help individuals. And they actually made post-traumatic stress syndrome even worse, all because of these well-meaning attempts to help others. So you can kind of think of it like this. Prospect theory says that gains here hurt worse than, or they actually feel not as powerful as a loss feels. So a loss is more hurtful. It really is a very painful experience for people. Similarly, you can kind of think of altruism bias as like this. When you're thinking of something as being helpful for others, you think of it as being more positive than it may actually be, right? And if you minimize the losses, you try and look away from them. And this kind of thinking can make things worse for people. So how does this impact you? For example, there's been a big push to have students have easy access to loans so that they could go to school, right? But the implications have been that debt is increasing by something like 6% each year from 2008 to 2011. It's up 10% in 2012. So student debt is exploding. So you can see here, here's the average student loan debt, but yet, look, the median income of getting a degree is going down. So these well-meaning attempts to help are actually creating a very large societal problem. Look at this. Student loans exploding. Credit card debt is actually less than the amount of student loans. And how this affects society, people can't buy houses when they graduate. They can't start new businesses. Everybody kind of pulls back a little bit. You don't want to take a risk. These have dramatic long-term effects, but all arising from very good intentions. Nationwide pension holds. There's estimates range that something like 1 trillion to over 4 trillion pensions are simply unfunded. There's no money available. Chicago, they pay out 678% of the actual annual revenue. So what is going on here? It's like, politicians promise things that sound really good, but actually create societal problems. So, here in California, there's issues that have risen from precisely these sorts of things. And it's almost like that problem with the Brazilian who suffered the stroke. What happened to him? He could empathize, but he couldn't use rationality in thinking about these kinds of problems. And this created horrific problems long-term for his family. Of course, I'm from Detroit. We all know what's happening with Detroit, right? So it's not like these things can't happen. They do happen, and they will happen even more as long as you're thinking only of individual perspectives of helping. Even nationally, look at this. Choosing the nation's fiscal future is a National Academy's report. And what this says is, in essence, if we as a nation do not grapple promptly and wisely with the changes we need to put the federal budget on a sustainable course, all of us will find that the public goals we most value are at risk. Science itself is telling you we are heading for very, very troubled waters. Why? Because we're helping, right? And it sounds so easy and so good to promise things that simply can't be fulfilled. When altruism is king, virtually anything can be justified, as opposed to when integrity and skepticism, as with science, is the approach to take. Science itself, when altruism is king, science becomes less rigorous, more politicized, and you'll have more corruption. What happens is something sounds good, so you find a way to publish it, right? Because it's what people want to hear. Diederik Stapel, one of the most corrupt psychologists, he just made up stuff, but was highly acclaimed in the field of psychology. He'd make up stuff like meat eaters are more selfish, right? He'd make up all his data. It sounded good. It was what people wanted to hear, and so they accepted it. So again, these well-meaning sorts of issues can lead to corruption in science and also in many other areas. So we can also see more easily interest or effects from special interest groups. And in big pharma, we think it's helpful because they're paying our paycheck, right? Or, likewise, you can see influence from government, unions, and the professorate itself. A cultural shift is in order. What can we do? Start becoming more skeptical. If someone says that something's really good, question that. That's not what you should be thinking. It's often something that someone has something to gain from it. Sometimes it's important to understand that you may hear that someone's really greedy and that's why they're doing, and you go, oh yeah, let's vilify them. But actually, their actions may be truly altruistic, the altruistic actions. So one-size-fits-all empathy is always helpful, is a way of just thinking emotionally about things. It's not using the reason that we were also designed to be capable of. We can have programs such as in codependency where we can analyze these kinds of issues that are related to empathy and problems with empathy. And textbooks can be rewritten so that what's being taught in classrooms is much more cognizant of what can truly be helpful for others. Journalism and media. Now, we know that not only does it, if it bleeds, it leads, but if it superficially sounds good, it must be good. And that's not something that is truly helpful for society at large. In fact, our government itself, when politicians can say things that sound superficially good and kind of get people on board in that way without sort of awareness of cognitive approaches, right, of rational trade-offs, well, it's not good for society at all to have people who are unwilling to be skeptical about the promises that we sometimes hear. I want you to remember that science is a gift. It's a great gift that allows us to leap the bonds of our current paradigms. And I hope that you will help take these ideas that altruism is not only one of the best traits that humans are capable of, but it also contains the most potential for danger. So with that, I thank you very, very much.
Let me pull a mic here, and if you have questions, if you'll raise your hand, I will find you, and I will bring you the mic, and you're free to ask what comes to mind. Who would like to be first? Got one down here.
Dr. Oakley, do you have any specific examples of destructive altruism you'd like to point out?
Oh gosh, where to begin? So the question was destructive altruism. Well, I think one of the best ones is probably genocide. Genocide itself often arises from, efforts to help others, right, or help those in your social group. So the Germans during World War II, they could blame everything on those evil, money-pinching Jews, right? And so it was easy to put them in this little box where, well, if we just kill them, then everything will be okay for our society. And it shocks me sometimes. I'll hear the vitriol, politically speaking, from both sides in our country, that, a certain, whatever your political beliefs are, must make you evil, right? And that anything can be justified to be done to you because of your beliefs. And that way lies such potential for problem. I mean, it's exactly the same thing we saw here in California, for example. I was born in Lodi, and my father was a veterinarian. He was a cattle practitioner, and he knew some of the Japanese who had been interned, and he thought, what a horrific thing it was that at the time these people lost everything. They had everything taken away from them, and then after the war, they had to climb back on their own. And yet, it was justified because we're helping our country, right? So we can do all these horrible things to people. And so it's so easy to happen, to vilify someone who doesn't believe the way you do. And of course, if all you have to do is put a label on them, and it's easy to do that kind of thing.
I think one of the more large-scale examples of altruism gone awry is the welfare programs run by the government. Since the Great Society of the 60s, over $10 trillion in present value has been spent, and it's created a permanent underclass. The probability of a child being on welfare, given if its parents, either of its parents are on welfare, is far higher than the average, American.
I think that's a very important point. We saw with Joan McCord's work, these desires to help and to provide things actually seem to build in a dependency, a feeling of dependency that makes people themselves choose to be underclass, sort of an underclass. So isn't it odd? The very helping programs that we implement are actually creating the things that we don't want to have created. So I think that's a very important point. And similarly with the housing bubble. I mean, there was this idea of let's go help people, let's allow them to get these easy loans, the government will support things, and of course that ended up in a bubble and an explosion and very, very problematic outcomes. So these kinds of social programs are well-meaning, they sound good superficially, and it's hard for people to protest them. For example, the projects, hey, we're going to rip down all these awful structures, and we're going to put the projects up. So that's going to be so much better for people. And if you say something, you're vilified because you're not being helpful, right? So, I absolutely agree. Other questions?
So this kind of reminded me of a debate that I always overhear my roommates. I live with two other guys, and they always debate about Walmart. And one of my friends says that they're doing a great thing, or one of my roommates is saying that they're doing a great thing by offering all the low prices to the lower income population, offering food and such and helping those people and families out. And then on the other side, a lot of the things that the corporation are doing are actually like hurting the small businesses, and just kind of, I don't know, that there's like a lot of other things that they're doing bad, but they kind of have that like superficial front to make it look like a good organization. How do you feel about that?
I think that's a very good question. One time I was sitting in a faculty meeting, and the chair of the sociology department was asked, why are your syllabi so some of them are 30 years old. They're just so obsolete. How can you run a department like this? And he said, well, yeah, I think we should probably upgrade them. But there's some things that you just can't put on a syllabus. For example, that corporations are evil. They're psychopaths. I always teach that, but I can't actually put it on my syllabus. And I'm sitting there kind of listening to this fellow, and he is only sitting in the room at my Oakland University because Oakland University land was donated by the wife of Matilda Dodge Wilson, one of the Dodge brothers. And that's the only reason he even had a job. I think a lot of times what happens is people, they think that if you're donating to Africa, which actually has horrific consequences of supporting despotic dictators and doing really malevolent things, that's a good thing. But if you're doing something like working and building cars for people, that's somehow being involved in the corporate, psychopathic behavior, even though cars are really helpful for people. So I think a lot of times it's hard for people to understand that businesses and corporations are all just in the business of doing something that people need and people want. They're actually helping people. And there's different ways to do it, and competition allows different businesses to be more or less effective in what they're doing. Walmart has trade-offs, but on the other hand, do we want a completely static society where it's always like 1960? I mean, there's going to be changes, there's going to be improvements, and so my personal feeling is I think that if someone is not making a lot of money, I want to make things available for that person at a low price. There are going to be trade-offs. It's always, altruism involves trade-offs. But, that's where I come down on that. Very good question. Very good question.
Yeah. In the back. I have the mic, sorry.
Okay.
Sorry to cut everybody else off. But, no, you showed the graphic up late in the PowerPoint about showing how the programs were increasing and spending was increasing. I was curious to see what your thoughts on were enriched media, and basically you had the last part about the media as well. Do you think that our enriched media and how we report things now affect our altruism programs and how we kind of just throw money at problems and not necessarily look at how to really solve them?
So you're talking about the press, right?
Yeah.
Absolutely. Individuals who I talk to in the press are often uniform in how they think about how to help others. And it's how they've been taught to think by going through largely social programs at universities. And it's often very superficial. If it looks like it's helping, that must be how it's helping. And sadly, the media has an enormous influence in general public opinion. I mean, that is why I believe, I think that what's going on now as far as intrusion and monitoring of communications is horrific. And if we saw, a President Romney now, people would be going berserk about this. But now, it's our guy. So we really don't want to say as much about this kind of thing. And there's not the uproar that there should be from liberals about this thing that actually affects deeply important liberal ideas and liberal approaches. So, yeah, good question. Thank you.
You talk about pathological altruism. I can certainly understand that some altruistic behavior could be harmful for both the people who are pursuing it and the people who are the objects of the altruism. But why do you medicalize the whole thing by talking about pathological?
It doesn't, the word pathological doesn't need to be medical, right? It can mean it's simply awry. And that is what I mean when I say pathological. It's not a medical diagnosis. Another way that I sometimes phrase it is altruism bias, right? And that's a little bit less leading. But I think part of it, too, is what I find so shocking is that individuals really do place altruism on this holy pedestal. And when you say pathological altruism, oh my word, it's almost like you've just done something scatological on a holy relic. And I suppose there's probably a little bit of intention on my part to help people say, you know what, it is okay to say that altruism isn't always good. And so that's kind of my way of trying to do. A little bit. And I don't think pathological is, I could have used much worse words. And so I think it's mildly attention-grabbing.
Okay, thank you.
Yes. I had a question about... Wait, hold it 1 second. Let me give you this. No, you're the first one.
I just had a question about the increasing accessibility of information via the internet and how that would impact your proposed idea of trying to minimize pathological altruism or affect it in any way.
I think a good friend of mine is a preeminent engineering educator, a fantastic individual. And so when I talk to him, he says, you know what, I spent 5 years in an inner urban school district helping individuals who were fifth graders and never done a homework assignment, never had a math problem corrected. They couldn't do addition, right? And so when I talk to this individual, he's like, all you got to do is just give them more money. That's all you got to do, right? And I'm sitting there going, I've spent 5 years working there, and I see the horrific effects of bad teachers who can't be fired, of what's actually going on in these inner urban. So what I'm really getting at is I could not make one impression on this individual. He was completely convinced that all you had to do was just throw more money at them. And why? Because he is completely convinced that the normal media, the mainstream media, is the only respectable media to listen to. And that's all he ever listens to. So by wearing this cloak of we're always even-handed, we never convey news that's artificial or incorrect, unlike those bad guys out there. People only watch certain media. They self-police as far as what they're open to watching. And that means that despite the open availability of information, people simply won't look at it.
Okay. I understand this model you're having with altruism of how it's problematic and whatnot, but this sounds like this could only work on a local level. If we look at this on a macro level, like on a global level, with our country and economic system right now outsourcing other jobs, could it still hold?
I think it's all the more important to look at it at a macro level. What happens is when you have only a few people who are, in the modern sense of what's going on in our country, for example, you can have just a few leaders who implement the policy for everything. And as you're beginning to understand, I think, one person or one group's ideas about altruism can actually be really damaging, even though it sounds great to those in that group. And so I think that when you have an open and free society where no one group has sort of the lock on how to help others, you have more freedom to have people in our country doing manufacturing, doing the kinds of things that need to be being done. And yet that can be crippled by individuals with very well-meaning efforts, right, who provide regulations that can stunt abilities of people to do things in this country, which can cause this kind of outsourcing. So that's a very good and very complex question that I'm afraid I can't really do justice to here. So I thank you for that and say, if I had another week, I could have even a much better answer, I would suspect, to your excellent question.
Hi. So earlier you mentioned pro-social and antisocial behavior, and you used subjectivity and objectivity to describe it. Given that everyone in the world is to some degree subjective, how do you decipher what is truly objective when dealing with social behavior in social situations?
Oh, you smart man. You can't, right? And the thing is, all you can really do is, in that sense, postmodernists with relativism, right, they have a very good point. Altruism itself, if you look at it from different cultures, have different ideas of altruism. In some cultures, it's a high sense of altruism to kill your parent when it's past the time and that parent is actually draining, the family. And that's considered very altruistic. So the best you can do is get this fuzzy idea of, if you step back and kind of look at it, you can get maybe a little bit more objectivity. And so I'm not saying that you can be totally objective about anything, but if you get a number of different people looking at things with transparency, with open minds, you're going to be better off than if you don't have those kinds of conditions. So that's about as good as I can get to truly objective, which of course you can't really do unless you're an objectivist, which I'm not. So, more questions?
Yeah. I remember you were talking about we sometimes see people that the actions they do, we call them like maybe bad intentions, greedy, may actually lead to good results. Do you see that it's possible that there needs to be a balance between what we consider selfish and non-unselfish have both ways can lead to good results and while trying to minimize bad results?
So the question you're asking is, can you kind of put it in a one-sentence nutshell so my tiny brain can grasp it more easily? We're going to talk about learning tomorrow, so you'll see that's one of the keys to learning is just chunk it into something small and graspable, and that's the best way to grab a new idea.
My writing teacher's laughing at me because. But my answer is: do you feel that there should be stricken a balance between selfish actions and unselfish actions that lead to good intentions, try to get to good results?
Okay, absolutely. I think that actually, I don't go around saying selfishness is where it's all at, right? That's just not me. But I think that selfish intentions can lead to really good things. And it's perfect. Right now, what happens is we mask our selfish intentions, even though they're natural. They're part of the human. Everybody's got some selfish. And if you didn't have this kind of selfish, you'd get stepped on all the time. So selfishness has its really good side, but excessive selfishness can also create problems. So yeah, I think a balance is definitely in order. It's not as bad as it can be cracked up to be, but taken in excess, you have Steve Jobs. Is that bad? Is it pathological? I suppose, but we sure all bet. I love my iPhone, so what can I say? Okay.
Is it me? Yeah. I agree with you that science is a gift, and I'm right here.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. I agree with you that science is a gift, and I think that relatively soon we will see science curing things such as hunger and thirst globally. Do you believe that this is altruistic in a deconstructive manner? And how can we discern between constructive and deconstructive altruism?
That's another. This is the best set of questions I have ever gotten from any audience, so I really commend you. If you look at when did humanity kind of start exploding? What happened that suddenly we were doing much better, in an evolutionary sense? And it actually occurred when we began to realize what causes disease. That was an enormous, enormous breakthrough beneficially for individuals. I mean, to my mind, one of the most horrific things that can happen is that your own child dies before you. And yet, people had to suffer that all the time until we came up with this medical breakthrough that allowed us to understand how disease occurred. So I think, are there trade-offs? Are there bad things? Is there overpopulation potential and so forth? Absolutely. But I think these kinds of breakthroughs can be powerfully positive for humankind. I personally do not want to ever see a family suffer from the death of their child, at 4 years old. I can't imagine a worse thing. And so, I'm completely on board. And I think that, looking at things from a scientific perspective can allow these kinds of breakthroughs to occur. And what I don't want to see is politicized science that doesn't allow people to develop this idea of integrity, of saying what the results truly are instead of what people actually want to hear, because it's looking honestly at what's going on. That's what's going to get us to what I think is truly most helpful for others.
I have one more question over here.
Over here. So the current world that we live in right now is the one that you described, right, where there's a lot of pathological altruism, right? So what if the opposite was true? What if we're all solely self-interested as human beings? Do you think that we would encounter a similar set of problems, or maybe a problem set that is on the opposite end of the spectrum?
I think that it would. So the question is, if we became much more selfish, the sort of the opposite end of the spectrum, instead of altruistically oriented, couldn't that create a raft of problems, or would it be more beneficial? And from my perspective, what I've been trying to bring out here in this talk is actually emotion and empathy isn't, it has bad aspects, but it is helpful. But a balanced approach where also cognition plays an important role is also helpful. So I think a balance. I'm always a little, I'm fascinated with the idea of paradoxes. What people seem to do is they grab one end of a paradox. They'll say altruism is always good, and then there's this other side, and it starts going up. And then they say, well, so greed is good. Yeah, we'll do greed, and they'll grab the other side. Instead of this idea of, wait a minute, we actually need both approaches. And I'll talk about this a little bit in learning tomorrow, this idea of paradoxes. We often believe that focused approaches to figuring something out is the only way to get something solved. Actually, it turns out to solve problems, you often need to turn your attention completely away from that problem in order to allow networks in your brain to make new connections that you need. So this idea of paradoxes, seizing one thing and saying that's really good and ignoring the other side, allows the other side to start rising. And what's really neat is a balanced approach. But balanced approaches are also dangerous because, well, let's see. Does that mean that, if genocide's really bad, maybe we should just have half a genocide, right? Maybe that wouldn't be, So you got to be a little careful with, this idea of the happy golden mean. But, I think just an appreciation of the value of both approaches is what's in order.
Barbara, one last question over here.
Okay.
Yeah, Adam Smith wrote about two fundamental human motivations. One is self-interest, which he described in The Wealth of Nations, and the other is what he called sympathy, which he wrote about in The Theory of Moral Sentiments. Can you comment on Adam Smith's treatment of sympathy and how that relates to your concepts of altruism?
I can comment on that on August 15th, which will be the time when I've completed a week-long seminar in the study of Adam Smith, because he's such an incredibly important thinker, and so I'm going to be attending some seminars on exactly that. I do think we need to be a little bit wary of, for example, thinking of sympathy versus empathy versus these kinds of things. I mean, these are all nomenclatures for what's actually going on neurologically within us. And often people will define sympathy in one way versus another way versus empathy. And so we need to be a little careful of the buzzwords. But I would be glad to answer that if you can wait until August. Okay.
Very good.
Thank you.
I'd like to thank Professor Oakley for coming and sharing this evening with us. Please join us at Flames.
And I would like to thank you again, and most of all, I would like to express appreciation to my husband, who's really a remarkable human being. I met him when I was working in Antarctica, and he's been, I met him at the South Pole Station, so I always say I had to go to the end of the earth to meet that man. And he's been my inspiration for decades. So I thank you all, and I thank you.
Let me also remind you again that we will have a lecture on how to excel at math and science tomorrow at 10 o'clock in Engineering 189.
Zombies, vampires, they are there. Yes.
Thank you all. Good night.